Footsteps echoed along the wet avenue, a solitary trail cutting through the icy silence of New York. Mark clutched his worn backpack to his chest, as if shielding the few fragments of a shattered life. He walked, invisible to the hurried executives who brushed past him, their well-dressed bodies ignoring the misery wandering among them. It was as though the city's asphalt were a stage where fate performed stories no one bothered to watch. For Mark, each step was a reminder of what he had lost: the wife he adored, taken from him in an accident, and his daughter Catherine, torn from his life after a bitter divorce. He had no answers, only a piercing emptiness that drove him forward without direction. Across the city, millionaire Henry Clark raised a glass in a luxurious restaurant, celebrating the launch of yet another venture worth billions. He smiled, surrounded by applause, but the truth was that he was as hollow as the empty glasses around him. Fate, however, had other plans for them both. When Henry left the restaurant that rainy night, a heart attack struck him down, leaving him motionless on the ground as passers-by hesitated to help. It was Mark who knelt there, driven by instinct, his calloused hands recalling long-forgotten first aid training. Henry's breath returned, labored, as the ambulance arrived. Before being taken away, Henry locked eyes with his savior and murmured, "I will find you." For Mark, it was just another night, but he had no idea that this moment would change their lives forever. Mark walked leisurely along the East River's edge, the cutting midnight wind sweeping papers and dry leaves across the sidewalk. He couldn't shake the image of Henry's gaze before the ambulance took him away. It wasn't gratitude, it was something deeper, a reflection of loneliness that Mark knew all too well. He tried to push the thought aside, but something within him whispered that that night wouldn't be easily forgotten. Hours later, Mark sought shelter in one of the community centers in Brooklyn. He knew the routine well: check his few belongings, secure a bed in the shelter, and wait for sleep to come. However, that gray morning, something disrupted his ritual. Two men in suits entered the shelter, drawing the attention of everyone inside. One carried a leather briefcase, while the other held a tablet. They looked around, visibly out of place, until one of the shelter employees approached them. "Can we help you?" the staff member asked, visibly wary. "We're looking for a man named Mark," the taller suited man replied, scanning the room. Before Mark could hide, he realized everyone was staring at him. There was no escape. "That's me," he said, his voice deep and cautious. The men approached. "Henry Clark asked us to find you," one of them said, handing over a card bearing the name of an impressive company. "He'd like to thank you personally." Mark hesitated. What did Henry want? Thank you seemed like a weak excuse for the effort these men had clearly made to locate him. Against his instinct to refuse, he nodded. "Tell him I'll be there," he said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. Hours later, Mark found himself in a luxury car headed for Manhattan. He watched the traffic, feeling increasingly out of place as the scenery shifted from simple, worn-down buildings to towering skyscrapers and gleaming storefronts. The car pulled up in front of an opulent building. The driver opened the door for Mark, who hesitated before stepping out. "He's waiting," the driver said, encouraging him to go inside. Mark was guided to a private elevator that took him to the top floor. When the doors opened, he stepped into a space that resembled an art gallery. High ceilings, glass walls, and furniture that looked straight out of a design magazine. At the center of the room, seated in a chair, was Henry Clark, visibly frailer than he had been the previous night. "Mark," Henry said, rising with difficulty, "you saved my life. Please, have a seat." Mark stood for a moment, uncomfortable with the formality. "It was nothing," he replied, avoiding direct eye contact with Henry. "Anyone would have done the same, but no one did," Henry countered with a faint smile. "I wanted to meet you, to know the man who, expecting nothing in return, gave me back my life." Mark sighed, looking down at the floor. "I'm just a guy who tried to help. There's not much to know about me." Henry frowned, intrigued. He had a peculiar talent for reading people, and the mystery surrounding Mark only intrigued him more. "Can I offer you something in return? A job? Money?" he asked directly. Mark lifted his head, finally meeting Henry's gaze. "I don't need charity," he replied curtly, but he quickly regretted the tone, remembering he was speaking to the most powerful man he'd ever met. "I'm sorry, it's not easy accepting help." Henry nodded slowly, understanding. "I get it," he said, leaning back in his chair. But if you ever change your mind, know that the door is open." The conversation seemed to be wrapping up when Henry, in a moment of impulsiveness, asked a question that would change everything. "Do you have family, Mark?" Mark froze. His mind was instantly flooded with memories of Catherine. He hesitated, trying to mask the tremor in his voice. "I did, but we haven't spoken in years." Henry noticed the weight of those words and decided to steer the conversation in another direction. "Well, if I can't help you directly, perhaps you can help me instead," he said, a spark of determination in his eyes. "I'm trying to better understand how to use my fortune to truly impact lives. Who better to guide me than someone who knows reality as it is?" Mark raised an eyebrow, skeptical. "I don't think I'm the right person for that." "You're the exact right person," Henry insisted. "Consider it, Mark. For now, at least stay here for a few days. A chance to restart." Mark hesitated, but eventually accepted Henry's offer. He was given a room on the same floor, and for the first time in years, he slept in a real bed. Yet the distrust lingered like a shadow. What did Henry truly want? And why would someone like him care? The next morning, Henry introduced Mark to the building's staff, treating him with a cordiality reserved for equals. But for Mark, the discomfort was ever present. He didn't know how to fit into this world of abundance. Still, something within him began to shift, a small spark of hope he hadn't realized he still carried. While Mark tried to adjust, across the city, someone equally lost in their past wandered the streets. A young woman with eyes reminiscent of Mark's gazed absent-mindedly into shop windows. Catherine. Fate seemed to be setting its pieces on an invisible chessboard. Mark woke up to the unfamiliar comfort of clean sheets and a soft mattress. For a moment he thought he was dreaming. But as the sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the guest room in Henry Clark's penthouse, reality came rushing back. The events of the past day replayed in his mind, leaving him with a mix of unease and curiosity. He had never asked for this opportunity, yet here he was, in the home of a man whose wealth was unimaginable. "Good morning," said a voice as he stepped out of the room. Henry was seated at a sleek dining table, a newspaper in hand, and a steaming cup of coffee before him. "How did you sleep?" Mark hesitated before answering. "It's been a while since I slept in a real bed," he admitted, his voice quieter than he intended. Henry nodded, as if understanding more than Mark had said. "Come, join me. Breakfast is ready." Mark sat down reluctantly, his eyes darting to the spread of food on the table. Eggs, fresh fruit, pastries, and other dishes he hadn't seen in years. He reached for a piece of toast, unsure if he could eat much. Henry poured him a cup of coffee and leaned back in his chair. "I've been thinking about what we discussed yesterday," Henry began. "I don't want you to feel like you owe me anything, but I also think you and I can help each other." Mark looked up, his brow furrowed. "How so?" "I've spent my life building empires," Henry said. "I have more money than I know what to do with, yet I can't shake the feeling that none of it means anything. I want to make a difference, but I don't know how. You, Mark, you've seen the world from a perspective I never have. You know what people need." Mark scoffed, shaking his head. "I'm not some expert, Henry. I'm just a guy trying to survive." "Exactly," Henry said, leaning forward. "That's why you're perfect for this. You don't see the world through the lens of privilege. You've lived through struggles most people like me can't imagine. Help me see the world through your eyes." Mark didn't know how to respond. He wasn't used to being asked for his opinion, let alone by someone like Henry. "I'll think about it," he said finally, his voice edged with skepticism. Later that day, Mark ventured out into the city. Henry had insisted he take some money and buy what he needed, but Mark couldn't bring himself to do it. Instead, he walked aimlessly through the streets, retracing steps he hadn't taken in years. As he passed by a park, he spotted a group of homeless men sitting under a tree, sharing a meager meal. He stopped, feeling a pang of guilt. That could have been him yesterday. It still could be him tomorrow. "Hey, Mark!" a voice called out. He turned to see an old acquaintance, Joe, a fellow drifter he'd met at a shelter years ago. Joe's face lit up with surprise. "Haven't seen you around. Thought you disappeared." Mark hesitated before approaching. "Yeah, things have been different," he said vaguely. Joe looked him up and down, noticing the slightly cleaner clothes and more rested appearance. "Different, huh? You get out of the grind?" "Something like that," Mark said, unsure of how to explain his current situation. He didn't want to sound like he'd abandoned the life he and Joe had shared. How have you been? Same old, Joe said with a shrug. But you look like you're doing okay. Got a place? Mark nodded slowly. Yeah, for now. Joe's expression softened. Good for you, man. Don't forget where you came from, though. Not everyone gets a lucky break. Those words stayed with Mark long after he left the park. Had he gotten lucky? Or was this just another twist in a life that never seemed to settle? Meanwhile, in a small cafe downtown, Catherine sat at a corner table staring out the window. She was lost in thought, her coffee untouched. She had no idea why she'd ended up in New York, a city that held no memories for her, only the faintest hope that she might find something or someone. Her phone buzzed, snapping her back to reality. It was a text from her roommate back in Boston. Any luck? She typed back quickly. Not yet, but I can't shake the feeling I'm close. Catherine didn't know what she was looking for. Her father, Mark, had vanished from her life when she was 13, and despite years of searching, she had never been able to find him. But something about New York felt different. It felt right. As she stood to leave the cafe, she caught a glimpse of a man across the street. He was walking with his head down, hands buried in his pockets. For a fleeting moment, her heart stopped. Could it be? But when she blinked, the man had disappeared into the crowd. That evening, Mark returned to Henry's penthouse, his mind heavy with memories and doubts. Henry was waiting for him in the living room, a glass of whiskey in hand. Rough day? Henry asked, gesturing for Mark to sit. Mark nodded, sinking into the chair across from him. I ran into someone I used to know. It made me realize how easy it is to lose everything. Henry studied him for a moment before speaking. And what would you do if you had the chance to get something back? Mark looked up, his eyes narrowing. What do you mean? Henry smiled faintly. I mean, what would it take for you to believe that a second chance is worth fighting for? Mark didn't answer, but deep down, he knew the question wasn't just about him. It was about the daughter he had lost, the life he had abandoned. And maybe, just maybe, it was about starting to believe again. The following morning, Mark found himself in an office unlike anything he'd ever imagined stepping into. The walls were adorned with abstract art, and the air smelled faintly of leather and expensive cologne. Henry had arranged for Mark to meet with a team of advisors. They were sleek, professional, and polite to a fault, but their eyes betrayed a mix of curiosity and skepticism. This is Mark, Henry announced, his tone authoritative. He'll be helping us rethink the way we approach philanthropy. Mark shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He still wasn't sure how he'd agreed to this. Henry's persistence had a way of wearing him down, and before he knew it, he was sitting in front of a group of strangers being introduced as some kind of consultant. One of the advisors, a sharp-suited man with a clipped British accent, adjusted his glasses and leaned forward. What exactly will Mark's role entail? He asked, his voice measured but probing. Henry smiled, clearly relishing the tension. Mark is here to tell us what we're missing. He's going to bring a perspective none of us have. The advisor nodded, though it was clear he wasn't convinced. Interesting. Well, Mark, perhaps you could start by telling us what you think are the most pressing issues for people in your situation. Mark bristled at the phrasing, but took a deep breath. First off, it's not just about giving people money, he began, his voice steady despite his discomfort. It's about giving them a reason to believe they can get out of the hole they're in. Hope, dignity, those are what matter. You can't buy those things, but you can make it easier for people to find them. The room fell silent. Even the skeptical advisor seemed taken aback. Henry beamed, clearly pleased with Mark's response. Exactly, Henry said, breaking the silence. This is what I've been saying. We need to stop throwing money at problems and start addressing the root causes. As the meeting continued, Mark began to feel a sliver of confidence. He might not have the polished eloquence of the others in the room, but his words carried the weight of lived experience. By the time the meeting ended, he felt a cautious sense of accomplishment. Maybe, just maybe, he could make a difference here. That evening, Mark wandered the streets of Manhattan. The city looked different now, almost as if he were seeing it through new eyes. The endless skyscrapers, the bustling crowds, it all seemed less overwhelming and more like a place where possibilities could unfold. But as he passed a small bookstore, something stopped him in his tracks. A young woman stood in the window display, rearranging books on a shelf. She had dark hair pulled into a loose ponytail and a contemplative expression that struck a chord deep within him. For a brief moment, he thought of Catherine, his daughter, and the memories hit him like a wave. He shook his head, forcing himself to keep walking. It wasn't her. It couldn't be. Catherine was probably living a life far away from his mess, and that was for the best. Across town, Catherine was sitting in her tiny apartment, poring over old photographs. Most of them were of her mother, who had died when Catherine was just a child. But there were a few of her father, taken before everything fell apart. In one, he was holding her as a baby, a proud smile on his face. In another, he was helping her ride a bike, his hands steadying her handlebars. She traced a finger over his face in the photo, her heart aching. "Where are you, Dad?" she whispered, her voice barely audible in the stillness of the room. Her search so far had been fruitless. She had scoured shelters and community centers, asking if anyone had seen a man matching her father's description. But New York was vast, and Mark could be anywhere or nowhere. Still, she couldn't bring herself to give up. She flipped through a notebook where she'd been keeping notes from her search. A name caught her eye: St. John's Shelter. It was one of the places she had yet to visit. Scribbling down the address, she resolved to go there first thing in the morning. The next day, Mark found himself back at Henry's penthouse, facing a daunting new challenge, learning how to navigate a world he barely understood. Henry had given him a pile of books on philanthropy and social reform, insisting he read them to better contribute to their work. "You expect me to read all this?" Mark asked, raising an eyebrow. Henry chuckled. "Not all at once. But if you're going to help me change the world, you'll need to understand how it works first." Mark sighed, flipping open one of the books. The words seemed foreign to him, filled with jargon and theories that felt miles away from his reality. Still, he forced himself to keep reading. If this was his chance to turn his life around, he wasn't going to waste it. Meanwhile, Catherine stood outside St. John's Shelter, her heart pounding. She had no idea what she would find, or if she would find anything at all. Taking a deep breath, she stepped inside. The air was heavy with the scent of damp clothes and industrial cleaner. A woman at the front desk greeted her with a polite but weary smile. "Can I help you?" "Yes," Catherine said, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm looking for someone. His name is Mark. Mark Faulkner." The woman's smile faded as she flipped through a clipboard. "Mark Faulkner," she repeated. "I'm sorry, but I don't think we've had anyone by that name here recently." Catherine's shoulders slumped, disappointment washing over her. "Thank you anyway," she said, turning to leave. But as she reached the door, a voice called out behind her. "Wait!" She turned to see an older man, a resident of the shelter, watching her intently. "You're looking for Mark?" he asked, his tone cautious. "Yes," Catherine said, her heart racing. "Do you know him?" The man hesitated before nodding. "I haven't seen him in a while, but last I heard he was staying at St. Catherine's over in Brooklyn." Catherine's pulse quickened. It wasn't much, but it was a lead. For the first time in days, hope stirred in her chest. Mark stared out the window of the penthouse as the sun began to set over the Manhattan skyline. Despite the books stacked on the coffee table and the opportunities Henry had thrown at him, he felt a gnawing unease. It was as though he were waiting for something, or someone, to remind him of who he was before life unraveled. His thoughts drifted back to Catherine. He hadn't seen her in over a decade. She would be an adult now, likely with a life of her own. He wondered if she hated him for disappearing, for not being the father she deserved. But then, hate required remembering, and perhaps she had simply moved on, erasing him entirely. The thought stung more than he wanted to admit. Henry interrupted his reverie, walking into the living room with 2 glasses of whiskey. "You've been quiet," he said, handing Mark a glass. "Second thoughts about working with me?" Mark shook his head, though he wasn't entirely sure if it was true. "Just thinking about things I can't change," he said. Henry studied him for a moment before nodding. "That's the thing about the past," Henry said, sitting down across from him. "It has a way of chaining you, even when you think you've moved on. But every now and then, it also gives you a reason to fight." Mark didn't respond. Instead, he took a sip of the whiskey and let the silence settle between them. Across the river in Brooklyn, Catherine stood outside St. Catherine's Shelter. The building was older than the last place she'd visited, its brick facade streaked with grime. She felt the weight of uncertainty as she walked up the steps and pushed open the heavy door. Inside, the shelter bustled with activity. Volunteers handed out meals, residents milled about, and the hum of conversation filled the air. Catherine approached the front desk, where a middle-aged woman greeted her with a kind smile. "Hi," Catherine began, her voice wavering. "I'm looking for someone. His name is Mark Faulkner. He used to stay here." The woman frowned, thinking for a moment. "Mark Faulkner. That name sounds familiar," she said. "Let me check." Catherine held her breath as the woman flipped through a logbook. After what felt like an eternity, she looked up. "He was here a few weeks ago," she said, "but he left. I think he mentioned something about Manhattan." Catherine's heart sank, but she forced herself to ask, "Did he say where he was going?" The woman shook her head apologetically. "I'm sorry, I don't know. But I remember he talked a lot about helping someone. Maybe he found a way to get back on his feet." "Helping someone?" Catherine repeated, confused but intrigued. The woman nodded. "Yes, he seemed hopeful, like he was turning a corner." Catherine thanked her and stepped back outside. The mention of Manhattan gave her direction, though it felt like chasing a ghost in the vastness of the city. Still, for the first time, she had something resembling a trail. She wasn't giving up now. The next day, Henry took Mark to visit one of the foundations he supported in the Bronx. It was a community center that provided job training and resources for underprivileged families. As they entered the building, Mark couldn't help but notice how much it reminded him of the shelters he'd lived in. A young woman named Clara, the center's director, greeted them warmly. "Mr. Clark, always a pleasure," she said before turning to Mark. "And you must be the new advisor I've heard so much about." Mark gave her a faint smile. "Advisor might be pushing it," Clara chuckled. "Well, we'll see about that. Come on, let me show you around." As they toured the center, Mark found himself drawn to the people. He saw men and women learning new skills, kids laughing in a daycare area, and volunteers handing out meals. It wasn't perfect. He could see the cracks in the system, the limited resources, but it was a place where people were trying. And that was something. "Most of the funding comes from Mr. Clark," Clara explained as they walked. "But we're always looking for ways to make it sustainable. It's not just about charity. It's about empowerment." Mark nodded, her words resonating with him. He thought of the men he'd seen at the park, the ones who would never set foot in a place like this because they'd given up believing it could help. "Do you have outreach for people on the street?" he asked suddenly. Clara paused, surprised by the question. "We try," she said, "but it's hard to get through to some. A lot of them feel forgotten, like no one cares anymore." Mark's chest tightened. He knew that feeling all too well. Meanwhile, Catherine wandered through Manhattan, her eyes scanning every face in the crowd. The city felt overwhelming, but she refused to let it break her resolve. She stopped in a small diner for coffee, pulling out her notebook to jot down her thoughts. A snippet of conversation from a nearby table caught her attention. Two men in suits were talking about Henry Clark, the billionaire philanthropist. "Did you hear? He's got some homeless guy advising him now," one of them said with a laugh. Catherine's ears perked up. "Homeless? Could it be?" She turned to the men, interrupting their conversation. "Excuse me," she said, her heart pounding. "What did you say about Henry Clark?" The men looked at her, startled. Nothing really," one of them said. "Just that he's working with some guy who used to be on the streets." "Do you know his name?" Catherine asked, barely able to contain her urgency. The man shrugged. "No idea, but Clark's office is in Midtown. You could probably find out more there." Catherine thanked them and hurried out of the diner. Her pulse raced as she headed for Midtown. For the first time, the pieces were starting to come together. She was getting closer, closer to answers, closer to her father. Mark sat in the quiet of Henry's office that evening, staring at a notepad filled with hasty scribbles. His time at the community center had stirred something in him, an urgency to act, to turn the nebulous concepts of hope and dignity into something tangible. But the weight of the task felt insurmountable. Who was he to shape the future of a system he barely understood? Henry entered, holding 2 mugs of coffee. "Burning the midnight oil?" he asked, setting one mug in front of Mark. Mark rubbed his temples. "Trying to. I'm not sure if anything I say will really matter." Henry leaned against his desk, his expression thoughtful. "You'd be surprised. Some of the biggest changes in my life started with ideas I didn't think would go anywhere." Mark chuckled humorlessly. "This is different. These people deserve better than someone like me stumbling through guesses." Henry sipped his coffee, considering his words carefully. "Mark, what you've lived through, what you've survived, that's not a weakness. It's your strength. Use it. Mark looked up, meeting Henry's eyes. For the first time, he saw not just a powerful man, but someone who genuinely believed in him. I'll try, Mark said finally. The next morning, Catherine stood outside the towering midtown skyscraper that housed Henry Clark's headquarters. She craned her neck, the sheer height of the building making her stomach churn. The thought of walking in uninvited felt absurd, but the hope of finding her father was stronger than her nerves. Taking a deep breath, she stepped through the revolving doors into the sleek, bustling lobby. The receptionist, a polished woman with a professional smile, greeted her. "How can I help you?" "I'm looking for someone who works with Mr. Clark," Catherine said. "A man named Mark." The receptionist's smile faltered slightly. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," Catherine admitted. "But it's urgent. Please." The receptionist hesitated before picking up the phone. "Let me see what I can do." At that very moment, Mark was in a meeting with Clara and Henry, going over ideas for improving the outreach program at the community center. He had been hesitant to share his thoughts, but as the discussion progressed, he found himself speaking with unexpected confidence. "What people need," Mark said, leaning forward, "isn't just a handout. It's connection. They need someone who'll sit down and listen, who'll make them feel like they matter." Clara nodded, impressed. "You're right. That's what we try to do, but scaling that kind of personal attention is hard." Mark frowned, thinking, what if you train people who've been through it themselves? People who've lived on the streets, who know what it's like. They could be the ones reaching out. Henry smiled. Now that's an idea worth exploring. Their conversation was interrupted by Henry's assistant stepping into the room. "Mr. Clark, there's someone in the lobby asking to speak with Mark." Mark's brow furrowed. "Someone asking for me?" The assistant nodded. "She says it's important." Henry glanced at Mark, intrigued. "Well, let's not keep her waiting." Catherine's heart pounded as she watched the elevator doors open. Mark stepped out, his face wary but curious. For a moment, Catherine couldn't move. She hadn't seen him in over a decade, and now, here he was, older, thinner, but unmistakably her father. "Dad?" she said, her voice trembling. Mark froze, the word hitting him like a punch to the chest. He blinked, his mind struggling to process the sight before him. "Catherine," he whispered. She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. Before either of them could think, she rushed forward and threw her arms around him. Mark stood stiffly at first, overwhelmed, but then he hugged her back, his grip tight as if afraid she might vanish. "I've been looking for you," Catherine said, pulling back just enough to see his face. "I never stopped looking." Mark's throat tightened. He didn't know what to say. Shame and guilt churned in his stomach. I didn't think you'd want to find me," he admitted. "Why would you think that?" Catherine demanded, her voice breaking. "You're my dad. I've missed you every day." Mark felt tears sting his eyes. "I thought I'd failed you, after your mom. I didn't know how to be there for you. So I stayed away, thinking it was better for you." Catherine shook her head, wiping her cheeks. "It wasn't better, Dad. I needed you." Mark looked down, his hands trembling. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Henry watched from a distance, giving them space but feeling the weight of the moment. It wasn't often he witnessed something so raw, so unguarded. He quietly gestured for his assistant to hold any interruptions, understanding that this reunion was more important than anything else on his schedule. That evening, Mark and Catherine sat together in one of the penthouse's quieter rooms. He listened as she recounted her years of searching, the dead ends and the faint leads that finally brought her here. She showed him photos of her life, graduations, friends, small victories he had missed. "I wanted to tell you everything," Catherine said, her voice soft, "but I was scared I'd never get the chance." Mark held one of the photos, his eyes lingering on the image of Catherine as a young teenager. "You grew up so beautifully," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I wish I could have been there." "You're here now," Catherine said, reaching for his hand. "That's what matters." Mark smiled faintly, though the guilt still gnawed at him. He knew it would take more than one conversation to mend the wounds of the past, but for the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of hope, a chance to rebuild what he thought was lost forever. The days following Mark and Catherine's reunion were a whirlwind of emotions and adjustments. Catherine stayed in a nearby hotel, and they spent every available moment catching up. For Mark, it was both healing and overwhelming. The walls he had built around his heart were slowly crumbling, but the weight of his past mistakes lingered heavily. One evening, they sat on a bench in Central Park. The autumn leaves swirled around them as Catherine held a photo of her mother that she had kept tucked in her wallet. "I still think about her every day," Catherine said, her voice soft. "It's why I couldn't let go of you, Dad. I knew she wouldn't have wanted me to." Mark stared at the photo, his chest tightening. The image of his late wife was frozen in time, smiling, vibrant, full of life. He remembered the accident like it had happened yesterday, the chaos and the grief that followed, the way he had crumbled under its weight. "I let you down after she died," Mark said, his voice heavy with regret. "I didn't know how to move forward. I thought walking away was the only way to stop hurting you." "You didn't stop hurting me," Catherine replied gently but firmly. "You just made me wonder if I wasn't enough for you to stay." Mark's breath hitched, the words cutting deeper than he expected. "You were always enough," he said, his voice breaking. "I just wasn't enough for myself." They sat in silence for a moment, the city's hum filling the gaps. Catherine finally slipped the photo back into her wallet and reached for his hand. "I don't care about the past anymore," she said. "You're here now. Let's focus on that." Back at Henry's penthouse, Mark found himself growing more involved in the philanthropic work he had once resisted. Henry's persistence, coupled with Catherine's belief in him, was slowly reigniting a sense of purpose he thought he had lost. One morning, Henry brought up an ambitious idea over breakfast. "What if we start a new initiative? Something aimed directly at reintegrating people like you, those who've been on the streets, back into society." Mark raised an eyebrow. "Like a halfway program?" "More than that," Henry said, his eyes alight with enthusiasm. "A full-scale effort, housing, job training, counseling, a bridge for people to rebuild their lives." Mark considered it, his mind racing. It could work, but only if you involve people who've been there. You can't have outsiders dictating what they think will help. It needs to come from within. Henry smiled. "That's why I need you to lead it." The suggestion hit Mark like a freight train. "Me? Lead it?" He shook his head. "I'm barely figuring out my own life. I can't." "You can," Henry interrupted. "You've already proven you have the vision. This is your chance to take what you've been through and turn it into something meaningful." Mark looked away, overwhelmed. A part of him wanted to believe he was capable of such a thing, but self-doubt loomed large. Still, Henry's confidence in him was unshakable, and Mark couldn't ignore the faint flicker of hope it stirred within him. Meanwhile, Catherine pursued her own quest for closure. She visited their old neighborhood, walking the streets where she had grown up. The house they had lived in was long gone, replaced by a sleek apartment complex. But the memories lingered, bittersweet and vivid. One afternoon, she found herself back at the small cafe where she had first overheard the men talking about Henry Clark. As she sipped her coffee, she opened her notebook and began jotting down ideas. Her search for Mark had reignited a passion she hadn't realized she had, helping others find the family, the connections they had lost. An idea began to take shape, a resource center for families separated by homelessness or economic hardship. It was ambitious, but the thought of helping others reunite the way she had with her father gave her a sense of purpose. When she shared the idea with Mark that evening, his reaction surprised her. "That's incredible," he said, his voice filled with admiration. "You've always been so strong. I don't know how I got lucky enough to have a daughter like you." "You're part of the reason I'm strong," Catherine replied. "Even when you weren't there, I held on to the hope that I'd find you." Mark smiled, though tears shimmered in his eyes. "Maybe we can do this together," he said, the words tentative but sincere. "Build something that helps others find what we've found." Catherine reached across the table, taking his hand. "I'd like that." As the days turned into weeks, Mark and Catherine began laying the groundwork for their respective initiatives. Henry provided resources and guidance, ensuring they had the support they needed. The idea of building something that could genuinely change lives filled Mark